Hook, I need you to look at somebody next to you if you got somebody and tell them, stop stressing, God's already working it out. No, you didn't say it like you believe it. Say it again with authority. Stop stressing, God's already handling it. Because the truth is, some of you walked in here carrying weight you were never designed to carry. You've been losing sleep over situations you can't control. Crying over doors God already closed. Worrying about tomorrow like God isn't already there. But I came to remind you today, God never told you to figure it out. He told you to trust Him through it. Some of you are stressed because you're trying to play a role that belongs to God. You're trying to fix people you didn't create, manage outcomes you can't see, and control timing that was never in your hands. And God is saying, why? Are you stressing over something I've already promised to handle? You're anxious, but He's already made a way. You're worried, but He's already written the solution. You're panicking, but heaven is not in panic mode. So today, we're breaking the spirit of stress, anxiety, and overthinking, because when God speaks peace, you don't have permission to stay. In chaos, stress comes when you forget who is in control. When you shift your focus from God to your problems, stress takes over. But peace returns when you remember God is still on the throne. God never asked you to carry what He already conquered. You're overwhelmed because you're holding on to things God told you to release. Overthinking is a sign you're trusting yourself more than God. Faith simplifies, doubt complicates. Stress grows where trust is missing. God's timing eliminates unnecessary pressure. You're stressed because you're rushing something that requires divine timing, not human effort. What you worry about, God has already worked out before you even recognize the problem. God had already prepared the answer. Stress drains your strength, but trust restores it. Anxiety weakens your spirit, but surrender renews your energy and clarity. You can't have peace and control at the same time. Either you trust God fully or you keep stressing, trying to control everything. God uses delays to develop you, not deny you. What feels like a setback is often preparation for something greater. Your situation is not bigger than God's solution. No matter how overwhelming it looks, God's power is. So outweighs your problem. Peace is a decision, not just a feeling you have to choose to trust God, even when everything around you feels uncertain. Stress doesn't just appear out of nowhere, it grows in the space where trust begins to fade. It shows up quietly at first, like a whisper in your mind, asking questions you were never meant to answer on your own. What if it doesn't work out? What if you're not enough? What if everything falls apart? And before you even realize it, that whisper becomes noise, and that noise becomes pressure, and that pressure becomes a weight sitting heavy on your chest. But the real issue isn't the situation you're facing, it's the shift in your focus. Because the moment you take your eyes off who God is and place them fully on what you're going through, stress finds an open door. You start measuring your problems instead of remembering His power. You start calculating outcomes instead of standing on promises. And suddenly, what didn't seem impossible yesterday feels overwhelming today. Not because God changed, but because your perspective did. You forgot, even if just for a moment, that you are not the one in control. And when you try to step into a position, Ishian, that was never yours to carry, the pressure will always crush you. That's what stress is. It's the result of trying to sit in a seat that belongs to God. Think about it. Think about it. Every time you replay a situation over and over in your trying to predict every possible outcome, what are you really doing? You're trying to control something that was never placed in your hands. You're trying to solve something with limited vision when God already sees the full picture. And because you can't see what He sees, you panic. Because you don't know what He knows, you worry. But just because you don't understand it doesn't mean God isn't already working it out. The truth is, God has never lost control, not once. There has never been a moment where He looked at your situation and said, I didn't see that coming. There has never been a time where he needed your help to figure things out. And yet, here you are, carrying stress as if everything depends on you, as if the outcome of your life rests on your shoulders, as if one wrong move will ruin everything. That kind of thinking will drain you because you were never designed to live like that. When you forget who is in control, everything feels. Everything feels heavy. Every delay feels like a denial. Every closed door feels like a failure. But when you remember who God is, something shifts inside of you. The same situation that once stressed you begins to lose its power, not because it disappeared, but because your confidence has been restored. You realize that if God is in control, then nothing is happening without purpose. Even the things you don't understand are still part of a plan you can trust. Stress makes you feel like you have to act immediately, fix everything instantly, and carry it all at once. But God operates differently. He's not rushing, He's not panicking, and He's not reacting. He's already ahead of you. While you're worried about tomorrow, He's already there. While you're trying to figure out the next step, He's already ordered your path. And the moment you truly accept that, stress begins to loosen its grip. But here's where many people struggle. They say they trust God, but their actions reflect worry. They pray, but then they pick the problem right back up. They ask for peace, but continue feeding their anxiety with overthinking. That's not trust, that's hesitation. Real trust means you are. Lease it and leave it in God's hands, even when you don't see immediate change. It means you choose peace even when your circumstances are still uncertain. It means you remind yourself over and over again that God is in control, even when your emotions try to convince you otherwise. And it's not always easy. There will be moments where your mind drifts back into worry, where fear tries to creep in again. But in those moments, you have a choice. You can either let stress take over, or you can realign your focus. You can remind yourself that the same God who brought you through before is still with you now. The same God who made a way in the past hasn't run out of solutions. The same God who opened doors you couldn't open is still working behind the scenes. When you truly understand that, stress starts to look different. It no longer feels like something you have to carry. It becomes something you recognize as a signal that your focus has shifted. A reminder to return to trust, because as long as you keep your eyes on God, stress can't stay where faith is strong. You were never created to carry everything you're trying to hold together right now. And deep down, you feel that constant tension in your chest, that exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, that mental weight that follows you from morning to night. It's not just because life is hard, it's because you're holding on to things God already told you to release. You're gripping tightly to situations, outcomes, people, and fears, as if everything depends on your ability to manage it. And the longer you hold on, the heavier it becomes. There's something inside us that struggles to let go. We convince ourselves that if we just think about it a little more, plan a little better, try a little harder, we can control how things turn out. We believe that holding on equals responsibility, that carrying the weight means we care. But what if the very thing you think is helping is actually what's hurting you? What if the exhaustion you feel isn't from the situation itself, but from your refusal to release it? Because here's the truth: God never asked you to carry what He already conquered. But that battle you're stressing over, He's already gone ahead of you. That situation that keeps you up at night, He already has the answer. The problem is not that God hasn't moved, it's that you haven't let go. And as long as you're trying to hold something in your hands, you're not leaving space for God to fully move in it. Think about how often you say you trust God, but still feel overwhelmed. That's the tension between belief and surrender. Trust says, God, I know you've got this. But surrender says, and I'm going to stop trying to control it. You can't carry both at the same time. You can't hold on to the weight and expect to feel peace. It doesn't work like that. The more you try to manage what belongs to God, the more pressure you place on yourself, and it shows up in subtle ways. You replay conversations over and over in your mind, wishing you could change what was said. You try to predict outcomes, hoping to avoid disappointment. You hold on to people who have already shown you they're not meant to stay because you're afraid of what happens if you let them go. You stress over timing, trying to force things to happen faster than they're meant to. All of it comes from the same place, the belief that if you don't hold it together, everything will fall apart. But what if everything falling apart is actually part of God putting things together the right way? Letting go doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're finally recognizing your limits and trusting God's strength instead. It means you're stepping out of a role that was never yours to begin with, because the truth is you were never meant to be the one who fixes everything. You were never meant to have all the answers. While you were never meant to carry the full weight of your life on your own shoulders. That's why you feel so drained. That's why your mind won't rest. That's why peace feels so far away sometimes. It's not because God has abandoned you, it's because you're trying to do his job. And God is not asking you to do that. He's not asking you to do that. He's not asking you to figure it all out. He's not asking you to force doors open. He's not asking you to hold together things he's already decided to remove. What he's asking you to do is trust him enough to release it, to loosen your grip, to stop trying to control every detail and allow him to move the way only he can. Because when you finally let go, something shifts. The weight doesn't feel as heavy. Your mind starts to quiet down. That constant pressure begins to lift. Not because the situation instantly changes, but because you're no longer carry. Angit alone. You're no longer trying to be the source of your own solution. You've placed it back where it belongs, in God's hands. And here's what's powerful about that: God can do more with what you release than you ever could with what you hold on to. He doesn't need your overthinking. He doesn't need your stress. He doesn't need your constant attempts to control the outcome.
What he responds to is your surrender.
Your willingness to say, God, I can't do this on my own, and I trust that you can. But surrender is a daily decision. It's not something you do once and never revisit. Every day you'll be tempted to pick the weight back up. Every day your mind will try to pull you back into overthinking, back into worry, back into control. And every day you'll have to choose again. Choose to release it, choose to trust, choose to believe that God is still in control, even when you don't see immediate results. And that choice is where your peace lives. Because as long as you keep holding on to what God told you to release, you'll keep feeling overwhelmed. But the moment you truly let go, you'll realize something you were never meant to carry in the first place. Overthinking fee is less productive, but it's often just fear wearing the mask of responsibility. It convinces you that if you can just analyze the situation a little longer, replay it a few more times, or consider every possible outcome, you'll eventually land on the perfect answer. But instead of bringing clarity, it usually multiplies confusion. One thought turns into 10, turn into 100, and before you realize it, your mind is tangled in scenarios that haven't even happened. And underneath all of that mental noise is a deeper issue. Trust has been replaced with self-reliance. Because when you truly trust God, there is a simplicity that follows. It doesn't mean you ignore reality or pretend challenges don't exist, but it means you're not trying to carry the burden of solving everything on your own. Trust allows you to move forward with peace even when you don't have all the details. Overthinking, on the other hand, is your mind trying to fill in gaps that were never meant for you to fill. It's you stepping into a role that belongs to God, trying to calculate outcomes with limited understanding while He already sees the full picture. You start asking questions that don't have clear answers. What if this goes wrong? What if I make the wrong decision? What if this opportunity never comes again? And instead of making a choice and trusting the process, you stay stuck in the loop of analysis. That's the exhausting part. You're not moving forward, but your mind is running constantly. It's like being on a treadmill that never stops. You're putting in effort, but you're not actually getting anywhere. The reason overthinking feels so intense is because it feeds on uncertainty. It wants guarantees. It wants control. It wants to eliminate every possible risk before you take a step. But life doesn't work that way, and neither does faith. Faith doesn't require you to have all the answers. It requires you to trust the one who does. And when that trust is missing, your mind tries to compensate by working overtime. It starts creating scenarios, preparing for problems that may never happen, and holding on to possibilities that drain your energy. What makes it even more difficult is that overthinking often disguises itself as wisdom. You tell yourself you're being careful, that you're just trying to make the right decision, that you're thinking things through. And while there's no thing wrong with being thoughtful, there's a difference between being wise and being trapped in your own mind. Wisdom leads to clarity and action. Overthinking leads to paralysis and stress. And the more you stay in that cycle, the more disconnected you feel from peace. You begin to doubt yourself. You second guess decisions you've already made. You question things that once felt certain. It's not because everything is suddenly wrong, it's because your focus has shifted inward instead of upward. You've placed the responsibility entirely on yourself, and now your mind is trying to carry more than it was designed to handle. But here's what changes everything: recognizing that you don't have to figure it all out. You don't have to solve every what if. You don't have to predict every outcome. You don't have to predict every outcome. God is not waiting for you to present a perfect plan before He moves in your life. He's not asking you to have complete understanding before you take a step forward. What He's asking for is trust, not partial trust, not conditional trust, but a deep, steady confidence that He is guiding you even when things don't make sense. When you begin to lean into that kind of trust, something shifts in you. Your thinking, the constant need to analyze starts to quiet down. The urgency to have everything figured out begins to fade. You realize that not knowing everything isn't a weakness, it's an invitation to depend on God. And instead of trying to control every detail, you start focusing on what's actually in front of you, the next step, the present moment, the choices you can make with the understanding you have right now. That doesn't mean your mind will never wander back into overthinking. There will be moments where the questions return, where uncertainty tries to pull you back into that cycle. But in those moments, you have a choice. You can either follow those thoughts deeper into confusion, or you can pause and remind yourself where your trust belongs. You can recognize that just because a thought enters your mind doesn't mean it deserves your attention. Overthinking loses its power when you stop giving it authority, when you stop treating every thought as something that needs to be solved and instead start filtering them through trust. You begin to ask yourself, is this helping me move forward, or is this keeping me stuck? And if it's keeping you stuck, you let it go. Not be. Because you have all the answers, but because you trust that God does. And that's where freedom starts to grow. not in having everything figured out, but in knowing you don't have to. Not in controlling every outcome, but in trusting the one who already holds them. Because when your trust shifts back to God, your mind no longer has to carry what it was never meant to hold. There's a kind of pressure that comes from feeling like everything has to happen right now. It builds quietly, almost invisibly, until it starts to shape how you think, how you move, and how you see your own progress. You look around and feel like you're behind. You compare your timeline to someone else's, highlight moments, and start questioning why your life isn't unfolding at the same pace. You begin to rush decisions, force connections, and chase opportunities that may not even be aligned for you all because you feel like time is slipping away. But what you're really experiencing isn't just urgency, it's the weight of trying to operate outside of God's timing. Because when you step out of divine timing, everything starts to feel heavier than it should. You put pressure on yourself to make things happen that were... I never meant to be forced. You interpret delays as failures instead of understanding them as protection or preparation. And in that space, stress begins to grow. Not necessarily because things are going wrong, but because you're trying to move faster than the pace God has set for your life. God's timing doesn't operate on panic, and it doesn't respond to pressure. It's intentional, precise, and purposeful. Every moment, every delay, every open door, and every closed one is part of a bigger picture that you don't fully see yet. But when you forget that, you start trying to take control of the timeline. You try to night to speed things up, thinking that if you just push a little harder, you'll get where you're supposed to be faster. What you don't realize is that rushing often leads you into places you're not ready for, or into situations that weren't meant for you at all. There's a difference between movement and alignment. You can be doing a lot and still be out of sync. You can be making progress on the surface while feeling deeply unsettled inside. That's what happens when you're driven by pressure instead of guided by purpose. You start chasing outcomes instead of trusting the process. And when things don't happen as quickly as you expect, frustration sets in. You begin to question yourself, your decisions, and sometimes even your faith. But God's timing removes that kind of unnecessary pressure, not by making everything instant, but by anchoring you in trust. When you truly believe that what's meant for you will come at the right time, you stop trying to control when it happens. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly things are unfolding. You stop comparing your journey to others because you understand that your path is uniquely designed. Think about how much stress comes from trying to meet expectations that were never yours to carry, deadlines you've created in your own mind, standards shaped by what you see around you, the belief that if something doesn't happen by a certain point, it never will. All of that pressure builds because you've stepped into a timeline that God never gave you. And the longer you stay there, the more exhausted you become. But when you realign with God's timing, something shifts internally. You begin to move with intention instead of urgency. You start making decisions from a place of peace rather than fear. You learn to wow it without feeling stuck, because you understand that waiting is not the same as being inactive. It's a season where growth is happening beneath the surface, where things are being prepared in ways you can't yet see. Waiting can feel uncomfortable, especially when you don't know how long it will last. Your mind will try to convince you that nothing is happening, that you're being left behind, that you need to do something in a thing to move things forward. But not every season is meant for visible progress. Some seasons are meant for development, for strengthening your patience, your character, your trust. And those are the seasons that often determine how well you handle what comes next. If everything happened exactly when you wanted it to, you might step into situations you're not ready to sustain. You might receive opportunities you don't yet have the capacity to manage. God's timing is not just about giving you what you want, it's about preparing you for it in a way that allows you to keep it, grow in it, and handle it with wisdom. So when things feel delayed, it doesn't mean they've been denied. It means there's something still being worked out either in your circumstances or within you, and instead of letting that create stress, you can choose to see it as part of a process that is working in your favor, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. The pressure begins to fade when you stop trying to control the clock. When you release the need for immediate results and start trusting that what's meant for you cannot miss you. When you understand that you don't have to rush into your purpose because it's already aligned with your path. And in that place, you find a different kind of strength. Not the kind that comes from pushing harder, but the kind that comes from resting in trust. You learn to move when it's time to move and to wait when it's time to wait without feeling like you're falling behind. Because you know that God's timing is not just right, it's perfect in ways you may not fully understand yet, but will one day look back on and be grateful for. Worry has a way of convincing you that everything depends on what you can see, what you can predict, and what you can control. It pulls your attention into the present moment and magnifies every uncertainty until it feels overwhelming. You start thinking that if you don't figure it out, right number, something will go wrong later. You feel like you have to stay mentally engaged at all times, as if constant concern will somehow prevent problems from happening. But the truth is, while you're worrying about what might happen, God has already gone ahead of you and made a way through what you can't yet see. Before the problem ever reached your awareness, the solution was already in motion. That's the part we often struggle to trust because we experience life in real time, step by step, moment by moment. We see the need before we see the provision. We feel the pressure before we recognize the purpose. And in that gap between what we know and what we don't, worry begins to grow. It fills in the unknown with fear instead of faith, with doubt instead of confidence. But God doesn't operate within that limitation. He is not discovering your situation as it unfolds. He's not reacting to your problems the way you are. He exists beyond the timeline you're trying to navigate, which means he has already accounted for everything that concerns you. The opportunity you're worried about missing, the decision you're afraid of getting wrong, the situation you don't know how to handle, none of it. T has caught him off guard, and more importantly, none of it is beyond his ability to resolve. What makes worry so exhausting is that it keeps you focused on questions without answers. It traps your mind in cycles of what if and how will this work, without ever bringing you to a place of peace. You replay possibilities over and over, trying to prepare for every outcome, but no amount of worrying actually changes what will happen. It only drains your energy in the process, and while you're doing that, God is still working, still aligning things, still opening doors you haven't even noticed yet. There's a kind of quiet confidence that comes when you begin to understand that what you're worried about has already been worked out. It doesn't mean you suddenly have all the details. It doesn't mean the situation instantly resolves. But it changes how you carry it. Instead of holding onto it tightly, you start to loosen your grip. Instead of trying to solve everything at once, you begin to trust that each step will unfold as it needs to. You realize that worry is not a requirement for responsibility. You can care about something deeply without allowing it to consume your thoughts. Why? You can be aware. That shift happens when you move from trying to control the outcome to trusting that the outcome is already in God's hands. And that trust grows stronger when you look back and recognize how many times things have already worked out in ways you didn't expect. Situations that once felt impossible somehow found resolution. Doors that seemed closed opened in unexpected ways. Paths that were unclear became visible over time. In those moments, you can see that even when you were worrying, God was already working. Even when you felt uncertain, He was already preparing what you needed. The challenge is holding on to that awareness in the present. Because when you're in the middle of a situation, it's easy to forget what you've already experienced. It's easy to let the current pressure override past evidence. But the same God who worked things out before has not changed. His ability has not diminished. His awareness of your life has not faded. If anything, those past experiences are reminders that you're not navigating this moment alone. Worry tries to convince you that everything depends on your effort, your planning, your ability to anticipate what's coming next. But peace reminds you that there's a greater plan already in place, a plan that doesn't rely on your constant mental involvement to succeed, a plan that continues moving forward even when you don't fully understand it. When you begin to internalize that, your relationship with worry starts to change. You may still have moments where concern arises, where uncertainty makes you pause, but it doesn't take over the way it used to. You're able to catch those thoughts earlier, to recognize that worrying is not adding value to the situation. And instead of following those thoughts deeper into anxiety, you redirect your focus. You remind yourself that just because you don't see the solution doesn't mean it isn't there. You acknowledge that the outcome is not dependent on your ability to figure it out. And slowly, that sense of urgency begins to fade. You don't feel the same pressure to resolve everything immediately. You don't feel the same need to stay mentally consumed by the problem. There's a release that happens when you truly accept that what you're worried about has already been handled in ways you can't yet see. It creates space in your mind, space in your emotions, space in your life, and in that space, peace has room to grow. Not because everything is perfect, but because you've chosen to trust that it will come together the way it's meant to. And that trust doesn't eliminate every challenge, but it changes how you experience them. You move through situations with a steadiness that isn't dependent on circumstances. You face uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. You carry responsibility without being crushed under its weight. Because you know that while you're doing your part, God has already taken care of the rest. Stress has a way of draining you in places you didn't even realize could feel empty. It doesn't just sit on the surface, it seeps into your thoughts, your energy, your motivation, and even your sense of clarity. You wake up tired even after resting, not because your body didn't sleep, but because your mind never stopped working. It keeps running in the background, processing problems, replaying situations, anticipating outcomes. And over time, that constant mental activity begins to wear you down. You start to feel like you're operating on low energy, like everything takes more effort than it seems. Should. Even simple things begin to feel heavy. That's what stress does. It pulls from your internal reserves without giving anything back. It convinces you that staying worried is necessary, that holding on to tension will somehow keep things under control. But in reality, it's doing the opposite. It's weakening your ability to think clearly, to respond calmly, to make decisions from a place of wisdom. The more you stay in that state, the more disconnected you become from the sense of peace and strength that you actually need to move forward. And what makes it more difficult is that stress often feels justified. You look at your situation and think, of course I feel this way, there's a lot going on, and you're not wrong. Life can be demanding. Responsibilities can pile up. Uncertainty can make things feel unstable. But just because stress feels understandable doesn't mean it's beneficial. It doesn't mean it's helping you handle things better. In fact, it often reduces your capacity to deal with what's in front of you. When you're stressed, your focus narrows in a way that amplifies problems and minimizes solutions. You start seeing everything through a lens of pressure, small issue. They feel bigger. Delays feel more frustrating, decisions feel more complicated. It becomes harder to separate what truly needs your attention from what doesn't. And in that state, your energy gets scattered. You spend it on things that don't require it, while the things that do need your focus get less of your best. But trust works differently. Trust doesn't ignore reality, but it changes how you engage with it. Instead of approaching everything with tension, you begin to approach it with steadiness. You recognize that not everything requires an immediate emotional reaction. Not everything needs to be solved all at once. And that shift alone starts to restore some of the energy that stress has been taking from you. There's a kind of strength that comes from trusting God that doesn't look loud or forceful, but it's powerful in a different way. It allows you to stay grounded even when things around you feel uncertain. It helps you conserve your energy instead of constantly expending it on worry. And over time, it rebuilds your capacity to handle challenges without feeling overwhelmed by them. When you trust, your mind begins to slow down. The constant stream of anxious thoughts starts. It starts to quiet, even if just a little. First, you're no longer trying to process every possible outcome at once. You begin to take things step by step, focusing on what's actually in front of you instead of everything that could happen in the future. That alone reduces the mental load you've been carrying. Your emotional state begins to shift as well. Instead of reacting to every situation with tension, you start responding with more balance. You're still aware of what's happening, but you're not consumed by it. You can face challenges without immediately feeling drained by them. And as that becomes more consistent, you start to feel a sense of strength returning, not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer exhausting yourself in the process of dealing with it. Trust also changes how you recover. When you're operating from stress, it's hard to recharge. Even moments of rest feel incomplete because your mind is still engaged. But when you're rooted in trust, rest becomes more effective. You're able to step away mentally, not just physically. You give yourself permission to pause without feeling like everything will fall apart in your absence. And that kind of rest actually restores your energy instead of just temporarily masking the fatigue. It's important to recognize that this shift doesn't happen all at once. If you've been carrying stress for a long time, your mind and body have adapted to that pattern. It may take time to fully experience the difference that trust can bring. There will be moments where stress tries to pull you back into old habits, where your thoughts start racing again, where you feel that familiar tension building. But in those moments, you have a choice. You can continue down the path of stress, letting it drain you further, or you can pause and redirect your focus. You can remind yourself that holding on to tension is not giving you strength, it's taking it away. You can choose to trust, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. And each time you make that choice, you begin to rebuild your energy little by little. Over time, that restoration becomes more noticeable. You feel more present, more capable, more clear in your thinking. You're not constantly running on empty. You're able to engage with your life without feeling like it's depleting you. And that's the difference stress takes, but trust restores. Not instantly, not all at once, but in a steady, consistent way that strengthens you from the inside out. There is a constant tension that exists when you're trying to hold on to control while also asking for peace. It's a quiet conflict, but it shows up in your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions. On one hand, you say you want calmness, clarity, and rest. On the other hand, you keep reaching for control, trying to manage every detail, predict every outcome, and ensure that nothing goes wrong. And without realizing it, you're holding on to two things that cannot coexist, because the more you try to control everything, the further you move away from the peace you're asking for. Then control feels safe at first. It gives you the illusion that if you just stay involved enough, think hard enough, and plan carefully enough, you can prevent mistakes, avoid disappointment, and shape your life exactly the way you want it. It makes you feel responsible, prepared, and aware, but underneath that sense of control is a constant pressure, a need to stay alert, a fear of what might happen if you let go, and that fear is what keeps you from experiencing true peace, because peace doesn't come from having, everything figured out. It doesn't come from knowing exactly how things will unfold. It comes from trusting that even if things don't go the way you expect, you will still be okay. It comes from releasing the need to control every detail and accepting that some things are simply beyond your reach. And that's not a weakness, it's a reality. There are aspects of your life that you were never meant to manage on your own. When you try to control everything, your mind stays in a constant state of activity. You're always thinking ahead, always anticipating, always adjusting. Even in moments that are supposed to be restful, there's a part of you that remains engaged, scanning for potential problems. That's why it's so hard to feel at ease. You may be physically still, but mentally you're still working. You're still trying to hold everything together. And the exhausting part is that no matter how much you try, control is never complete. There will always be variables you can't account for. People will make choices you didn't expect. Situations will shift in ways you didn't plan for. Opportunities will come and go outside of your timing. And each time that happens, it challenges the senator. This essence of control you've been trying to maintain,
I remind you that no matter how much effort you put in, you can't guarantee outcomes. That's where the frustration begins.
Because when you've been relying on control, any disruption feels like a failure. You start questioning yourself, wondering what you could have done differently, how you could have prevented it, why things didn't go according to plan. And in that process, you take on responsibility for things that were never yours to carry in the first place. Letting go of control doesn't mean you stop caring or become passive. It doesn't mean you ignore your responsibilities or stop making decisions. It means you shift your role. Instead of trying to control outcomes, you focus on your actions. Instead of trying to guarantee results, you do your best with what's in front of you and trust God with the rest. That shift may seem small, but it changes everything about how you experience life. When you release control, your mind begins to quiet, not because everything is suddenly perfect, but because you're no longer trying to manage what's beyond you. You allow yourself to exist in the present moment without constantly projecting. Into the future, you make decisions without needing absolute certainty. You move forward without requiring guarantees. And in that space, peace begins to grow. It's not a dramatic or instant transformation. It's subtle at first. You notice that you're not reacting as quickly to uncertainty. You feel less urgency to figure everything out immediately. You're able to pause before letting your thoughts spiral. And over time, those small changes build into a deeper sense of calm. You begin to understand that peace is not something that happens to you, it's something you choose, not once, but repeatedly. Every time you feel the urge to control, you have a decision to make. You can either follow that urge and step back into stress, or you can release it and return to trust. And that choice shapes your experience more than the situation itself. There will still be moments where you feel the pull of control. Times when uncertainty feels uncomfortable, when outcomes feel important, when the stakes seem high. In those moments, letting go may feel difficult. Your instincts will tell you to hold on tighter, to think more, to do more. But that's exactly when you need to remind yourself that, control is not giving you peace, it's taking it away. Peace comes when you accept that you don't have to carry everything, that you don't have to know everything, that you don't have to manage every possible outcome. It comes when you trust that God is present in the parts of your life you can't control, just as much as He is in the parts you can. And the more you practice that, the more natural it becomes. You start to approach life with a different mindset, one that is steady instead of anxious, open instead of rigid, trusting instead of fearful. And while your circumstances may still change, your internal state becomes more consistent because you've stopped trying to control everything, and in doing so, you've made room for the peace you've been searching for all along. Delays have a way of stirring something deep inside you. They test your patience, challenge your expectations, and often make you question whether things are moving at all. When something doesn't happen when you thought it would, it's easy to interpret that pause as a sign that something is wrong. You start to wonder if you missed your opportunity, if you made the wrong decision, or if what you were hoping for it is simply not going to happen. And in that space of uncertainty, frustration begins to build. But what if the delay you're experiencing isn't a denial? What if it's not a sign that things are falling apart, but rather an indication that something is still being prepared? Because not everything that takes time is being withheld. Some things are being developed, shaped, and aligned in ways that you can't yet see. And the challenge is learning to trust that process even when it doesn't match your expectations. Delays feel uncomfortable because they interrupt the pace you had in mind. You create a vision of how things should unfold, how quickly progress should happen, and when certain milestones should be reached. And when reality doesn't align with that vision, it creates tension. You feel like you're stuck, like you're waiting without movement, like time is passing without purpose, but that perception isn't always accurate. Just because something isn't happening visibly doesn't mean nothing is happening at all. There is a kind of work that takes place beneath the surface, growth that isn't immediately noticeable, changes that are happening internally in your mindset, your perspective. Tithe your readiness, and those changes are just as important, if not more important, than the external outcome you're waiting for. Because what you're becoming in the process determines how well you'll handle what you eventually receive. If everything happened instantly, without any period of waiting, you might step into situations without the capacity to sustain them. You might receive opportunities you're not fully prepared for, or encounter challenges you don't yet have the strength to navigate. Delays create space for that preparation. They give you time to develop resilience, clarity, and understanding. They allow certain aspects of your life to align so that when things do move forward, they do so with stability. But it's difficult to see it that way when you're in the middle of waiting. Your focus tends to stay on what hasn't happened yet. You measure time by what you're missing instead of what you're gaining. You compare your journey to others who seem to be moving faster, achieving more, reaching milestones you haven't reached yet. And in that comparison, the delay starts to feel like a disadvantage. However, every path is different. What looks like delay in your left, life might actually be alignment in progress. What feels like being held back might be protection from something that isn't meant for you. There are situations you could have stepped into earlier that might not have been right for you at that time. There are connections that needed to shift, circumstances that needed to change, aspects of yourself that needed to grow before the next step could unfold in the right way. When you begin to consider that possibility, your perspective on delay starts to shift. It's no longer just something to endure, it becomes something to understand. You start asking different questions. Instead of why is this taking so long, you begin to wonder what is being developed during this time. Instead of assuming that nothing is happening, you become more aware of the subtle ways in which things are changing. That awareness doesn't eliminate the discomfort entirely. Waiting can still feel challenging. There will still be moments where impatience rises, where you wish things were moving faster, where you feel ready for what's next. But in those moments, you have an opportunity to respond differently. Instead of letting frustration take over, you can reminisce. Do yourself that timing is part of the process. Delays also teach you how to remain steady without immediate results. They strengthen your ability to stay committed even when progress isn't visible. They help you develop a sense of trust that isn't dependent on constant movement. And that kind of trust becomes valuable, not just in this situation, but in everything you face moving forward. Because life will always include moments where things don't happen as quickly as you'd like. There will always be seasons where you have to wait, where outcomes are uncertain, where the next step isn't immediately clear. And how you navigate those seasons shapes your overall experience. If you approach them with resistance, they will feel heavy and frustrating. But if you approach them with understanding, they become more manageable, even meaningful. Over time, you may even look back and realize that what you once saw as a delay was actually necessary, that the extra time allowed things to come together in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, that the growth you experienced during that period prepared you for what came next in ways you couldn't have anticipated. And that realization, Ion changes how you see future delays. They no longer feel like something to fear or resist. They become part of a pattern you've come to recognize, one where timing plays a role in shaping outcomes in ways that go beyond immediate understanding. So even though it's not always easy, there is value in the waiting, there is purpose in the pause, and there is something being developed even when it's not yet visible.